The ceremonial sword hung suspended, its tip stained, while a voice demanded remembrance. Instructor stood before the hall and defined their charge as the Dragon Slayer. He told the students their task was to kill dragons and stop monsters trampling innocent lives. He framed the role as both a calling and a duty. The message left no nuance about motives. Instructor smiled as he held a sheet and reiterated the command. The students sat in rows and absorbed the decree in silence. The sword hung suspended, while a voice reminded everyone of its purpose. Instructor then addressed the hall and welcomed the new freshmen as academy members. A radiant seal of light marked the academy's long lineage and the day's ceremony. He framed their charge plain and told them they existed to annihilate dragons. Panels showed mottos about history and the school's 100 years of service. Instructor held a sheet and repeated the academy's unambiguous command to them. Close shots of students' eyes closed the sequence with silent, solemn focus. The sword had hung above the hall while the instructor's words faded from memory. Students spilled onto the wide marble, steps beneath bright sky and ringing banners. The protagonist moved forward alone, shoulders tense beneath his uniform and insignia. The view opened to reveal the academy domes and the city beyond. Hexagonal mottos drifted across the air, invoking past sacrifices and the school's command. The crowd's chatter rose as undergraduates scattered in every direction. He reached the bottom of the steps and stared, breath shallow and eyes wide. A black speech bubble shattered his silence with explicit disbelief and confusion. The sword still hung above the hall as the instructor's words faded and the students spilled onto the wide marble steps beneath the bright sky. The protagonist moved forward alone, shoulders tense beneath his uniform and insignia, and the view opened to reveal domes and the distant city with drifting hexagonal mottos. Chatter rose while he reached the bottom of the steps and stared, breath shallow and stunned. A sharp black thought shattered his silence. The panels jagged into darkness where a gloved hand closed, a shadowed armored voice cursed, another voice begged not to be killed, and the image ended with him on the ground looking up, shocked. The sword still hung above the hall, an accusation as silence settled. The protagonist lay on the marble, limbs trembling, his uniform dark with blood. He told himself he had definitely killed them, voice sharp and small. A red thought warned he would be troublesome if all of them died. An armored voice answered, calm, suggesting they wait a little longer now. The voice held clear intent and a patient threat beneath its quiet tone. The protagonist looked up, eyes wide, blood forming tracks on his cheek. Guilt and fear sat heavy inside him as he waited for an answer. The sword still hung above the hall, casting accusation across the silent chamber. The protagonist lay on the marble floor, uniform soaked and limbs trembling with pain. He told himself he had surely killed someone and could not turn time back. No magic spell could rewind events, and he feared a dragon might be involved. He rose to his feet, eyes burning, and warned in a low, furious voice. He turned panic into steel resolve, vowing to kill any dragon that appeared. The sword still hung over the hall, its stain marking the cold marble. The protagonist rose and ran up the blood-darkened stairs, driven by his vow not to let anyone die. A voice called from the landing and drew him onward. A red-haired student intercepted him and asked if he was hurt, her concern steady as she searched him. She then mouthed a name, Rudo, like a play. The hall echoed with his promise and the faint rustle of urgent footsteps. The sword still hung over the hall, its stain cold on the marble. The protagonist had sprinted up the blood-darkened stairs, driven by a stubborn vow. A voice from the landing drew him onward, and a red-haired student intercepted him. She searched him with steady concern and mouthed Rudo as a pleading name. She then spoke his name, Henith Harpulia, and claimed to know him as a top entrant. She asked if he was sick and said he had sulked since the Scarler incident. She called his behavior rare and almost crazed for an Areales entrant. He froze and stood uncertain, unable to answer beyond a single puzzled question. The protagonist thought Henith Harpulia was as rude as always while she prodded him. She teased him aloud, asking if he was laughing and if he enjoyed curses. He insisted it was not like that and apologized if he had upset her. She brushed it off and called him a pervert before saying never mind aloud. She admitted she let his behavior slide because he was a brat, yet warned him. He froze, absorbed the barbs, and then steeled himself to move into the hall. After absorbing Henith Harpulia's earlier jabs, the protagonist kept his distance and entered the hall. A long formal address concluded above them, and the chamber's ceiling and chandeliers framed the end. Henith stretched and called the speech filthy and far too long aloud. She sank into a chair and treated the insult like a casual jest. The protagonist watched her, weighing whether to answer or remain silent. He considered speaking openly, but chose restraint to avoid escalation. He told himself he could endure because patience functioned like a musician's discipline. Henith stretched and mocked the speech, treating the insult like a casual jest. She then introduced the banquet and asked the nearby freshman his name. The protagonist replied Rudo Donatos and kept silent to avoid escalation. Henith admitted she had not heard of his family before. She warned he might not know much and mused about that. Her mother interjected, instructing Henith to remain aloof from worthless fools. Henith answered obediently and inwardly thanked those lessons that kept her restrained. The hall resumed quiet activity around them. Henith Harpulia leaned forward and offered to teach the protagonist about the academy's notable people. She tapped the hall and pointed toward the second floor, where famous guild leaders gathered. She explained that they sought good talents and kept watch for promising prospects. She named the leader of Pulsier as present among the gathered leaders. The surrounding students quickly followed her gesture and scanned the crowded balconies. The protagonist listened closely and privately recognized many of the names and faces. He imagined the achievements they might attain and, darkly, their eventual deaths. He let his face show calm while his thoughts remained sharp and cold. Henith Harpulia leaned forward and named her chosen guild an idol to the protagonist. She praised Lyana Chernica, the White Flame Empress, and described the purity of her magic. Henith explained Lyana's death at the hands of the Dragon King and its cost. She said that Henith became the next Midsummer Flame leader to honor that memory. Henith added that she burned her life in the pursuit of vengeance for her senior. The protagonist listened in the crowded hall and kept his face composed and cold. Nearby students scanned balconies where guild leaders gathered and whispered in quiet awe. Henith Harpulia had leaned forward and named her chosen guild an idol to the protagonist. She had praised Lyana Chernica and described the purity and cost of that magic. She had explained Lyana's death at the hands of the Dragon King. Henith had taken the Midsummer Flame leadership to honor that loss. The hall had filled with students and guild leaders who watched. A peer praised Henith's prospects, and she accepted the compliment with a smile. The instructor called Henith to read her oath, and she stepped forward. The protagonist's memory aligned with the ceremony, and a single thought of brother rose as his hands clenched the seat. Henith's oath had just ended, and the hall's attention shifted outward. A portrait caption declared the Aroim's student council president, Rudo Donatos. The narration praised him as a genius and warrior who died for his brother. The protagonist's chest tightened at the memory, and the word brother surfaced again. A young man then spoke from the dais and introduced himself as Jeremy Duval, the student body president. He addressed the assembly about dragons and mass destruction. He reminded the students of their admissions cost and urged them to be proud. The hall listened and the protagonist watched. Henith's oath had ended and the hall's focus shifted outward. A caption named the institution the Dragon Annihilation Academy and framed its purpose. Jeremy Duval rose and spoke from the dais to address the assembly. He declared that, as the name implied, they must kill dragons. He added that motive did not matter whether duty or entertainment. The protagonist's chest tightened, and he swore inwardly at the confusion. A quick memory cut to a courtyard where a woman urged a child. The woman insisted they remember the dragon slayer's importance and legacy. The protagonist found it impossible to accept that the student council president was his brother. The hall shifted focus back toward the dais after Henneth finished his oath. Jeremy Duval rose, and students learned he was the student council president. A red-haired student grabbed a friend and dashed through the crowd to catch up. The protagonist overheard murmurs that tied Jeremy to his family and to power. Someone asked whether Rudo Donatos belonged to the student council and waited for answers. A nearby student apologized to a confused new entrant unfamiliar with the name. Attention returned to the dais after Henneth finished his oath. Jeremy Duval stood, and the students learned his role as council president. A red-haired student pulled a friend through the crowd to follow him. The protagonist overheard murmurs linking Jeremy to family influence and the council. Someone asked whether Rudo Donatos belonged to the council and waited for reply. A nearby student apologized to a confused new entrant. The protagonist realized one person did not know his brother. An ominous thought came to him that Acer Donatos might not exist. Attention had returned to the dais after Henneth Harpulya finished his oath. Jeremy Duval rose, and the students learned his role as council president. The instructor dismissed the ceremony and instructed newcomers to go to assigned classrooms. Confetti and bells marked the end as the crowd dispersed across the campus. The protagonist stood on the steps and replayed murmurs linking Jeremy to family influence. He dismissed the idea as a ridiculous assumption. Yet he could not fully banish the image that Acer Donatos might not exist here. The doubt lingered while students scattered toward classrooms. After the ceremony, the protagonist drifted through the dorm corridor while doubts nested. He thought if Acer Donatos truly existed, or if Rudo Donatos had been a rumor. Visual captions outlined a theory that Acer might be absent despite the name. The protagonist sat alone in class and turned the idea over again. Henneth Harpulya noticed him and asked what he was thinking. Their conversation cut through the quiet and shifted the moment toward ordinary student life. The crowd dispersed and routine returned. After the ceremony, the protagonist wandered the dorms and kept turning rumors over. He doubted whether Acer Donatos existed or whether Rudo Donatos was merely a rumor. In class, he sat apart and replayed the speculation in private. Henneth Harpulya noticed his silence and asked what he was thinking. Their talk cut through the quiet and shifted the moment toward ordinary student life. She suggested checking the library and urged him to go search immediately. He left class with her close behind, then he snapped who had followed him. After class, the protagonist left with Henneth Harpulya close behind. He had already snapped at an unseen follower, and she cut into the silence with sharp teasing. She pressed him about approaching the council president and accused him of seeking attention. He denied the charge and said he had only asked questions. In the stairwell, she probed about the library, and he admitted the book was not there. She laughed, called him an idiot, and commanded him to follow as she strode ahead. After class, the protagonist followed Henneth Harpulya into the academy's central library, doors tall and ornate. Henneth Harpulya's face brightened as she pushed the doors open and exclaimed in wonder. She declared she had long wanted to visit and urged him to look around. The protagonist remained reserved and glanced over the vaulted stacks, measuring expectations quietly. He recognized the room, yet thought he had never been there in a past life. After a pause, he chose to search the record book first, focusing on facts. After class, the protagonist followed Henneth into the academy's tall central library. Henneth brightened and opened an old catalog, fingers tracing the gilt spine. She exclaimed at the rare student register and urged him to look. The protagonist checked the record book first and scanned page after page. He searched for Acer Donatos among the printed names, but found none. He suspected the absence was tied to that bastard from his past. Henneth looked stunned and then pushed the book toward him for confirmation. After they left the catalog, the protagonist recalled a name and a shadowed title. Text labeled Void Dragon Sartnin described a dragon king that controlled the void and dimensions. He remembered how, during the last subjugation before his regression, someone had vanished with his brother's body. He suspected the skill had shifted the man into another dimension. He feared Acer Donatos might still be alive there. The protagonist closed the register and rested his fingers on the leather cover. He peered into the library corridor as voices urged them to leave. After he closed the register, the protagonist set the leather cover down. He still held the name of Void Dragon Sartnin and Acer Donatos. The library bustle pulled him back toward the present. Henith Harpulia loudly claimed she was only borrowing 17 books. An instructor reminded her borrowers could take no more than 3. They traded words, then dashed from the hall in haste. The students ran past the courtyard and nearly missed the class. In the classroom, Henith and the protagonist sank into seats and sighed. They spoke quietly about timing and borrowed books before the lesson began. The class quieted when the instructor stepped forward and called out a greeting. He introduced himself as Daniel Gold and said he would teach basic combat. He announced the subject would occupy them for the entire year without compromise. Daniel explained he planned to train weapon skill and martial arts every session. He warned he would be seeing the students more often and more strictly. Excited murmurs and strained faces circled the room as classmates reacted openly. Henith and the protagonist exchanged looks and braced for the coming lessons. The instructor stepped forward and joked about brutal internship tests and feeling like dying a lot during training. He then smiled and insisted it was not impossible with hard work. Henith Harpulia and the protagonist exchanged a wary look across the classroom as the session opened. The protagonist's thoughts turned inward. Talent mattered more than effort, and he understood the shame and desperation that drove students. He remembered enduring harsh measures to gain some ability and pressed a hand to his chest. The instructor closed by saying the first day should be enough for a short stay. The instructor stepped forward and gave a blunt command about avoiding casualties while training. He dismissed the session, and the students gathered their things amid low voices. Henith Harpulia called after the protagonist and questioned his direction, prompting a terse reply and a sharp look. A brief, inward moment from Henith showed concern, while the protagonist moved toward the courtyard. Overhead, a caption stated the cruel truth about the Dragon Slayer. The protagonist adjusted his collar and set his jaw before leaving the academy walls. After leaving the academy grounds, the protagonist entered the familiar training room from his youth. A caption over the panels stated that stamina remained the most fundamental skill. He eased the heavy door and stepped onto stone floors beneath a suspended wooden beam. He gripped the beam to test old strength, remembering how often he trained. He began counting aloud while pulling his weight and forcing each repetition. 10 passed, then 20, then 30, but his hands trembled and fatigue showed. He stopped short, arms shaking, and measured how far he had drifted from youth. After the pull-up set, the protagonist sat on the cold stone, gasping for breath. He pressed his palms to his knees and scolded himself as useless and weak. He thought of upcoming combat classes that would begin the next day. He realized there was only one day before sparring rules. The realization sharpened his resolve to reclaim stamina and skill. He watched the ceiling and plotted incremental repetitions and recovery. He admitted he had fallen far from youth, but promised to push back towards strength. He had promised to push back towards strength, and he kept training. He stretched his shoulders and arms and told himself he was already an expert at working hard. He flexed and prepared for the next day's sparring with steady, measured motions. A door sounded, and he turned to see a red-haired student step inside and hesitate. He registered surprise at the early arrival and thought he did not expect to see the visitor so soon. Names rose unbidden in his mind, Henry and Balak Steros tied to a past life. He breathed out and returned to his routine. Protagonist had pledged to regain strength, and he kept training each morning. He stretched his shoulders and arms and told himself he already worked harder than most. He flexed and prepared for sparring with steady, measured motions. A door sounded and protagonist turned to see a red-haired student step inside and hesitate. He registered surprise at the early arrival and had not expected the visitor so soon. Names from a past life surfaced unbidden, Henry and Balak Steros, and he breathed out before returning to his routine and steadying his focus. Protagonist had kept training each morning, stretching shoulders and preparing for sparring. A door sounded and Henith Harpulia entered, paused near the threshold, and hesitated. A past life name, Balak Steros, surfaced in his thoughts, though he had never met him there. He had come to this training room after the military examinations and intended to keep to his routine. Henith closed the distance and watched him. They exchanged a brief, wordless look. Protagonist steadied himself and resumed measured motions. They trained side by side until a dumbbell fell and struck the floor, breaking the silence. Protagonist had kept training every morning since the military examinations ended, maintaining his routine. Henith Harpulia entered, paused at the threshold, then closed the distance to watch him. They trained side by side until a dumbbell fell and struck the floor, breaking the silence. Protagonist snapped, shouted, and accused Henith of trying to pick a fight with him. Henith set the weights down and explained he had only been exercising nearby. He apologized for the misunderstanding and praised Protagonist's posture and muscle control. Protagonist froze, confused by the sudden compliment and the unexpected attention in the room. Both students fell into awkward silence, their routine briefly unsettled and taut. Protagonist continued his morning training, following the military examinations to maintain his routine. Henith Harpulia had stepped into the room and stayed nearby during the last session. That morning, a new encounter disrupted their quiet practice and shifted the mood. A muscular freshman introduced himself as Rudo Donatos and claimed he would be their workout master. Another freshman identified himself as Balak Steros and then requested to be his student. Rudo boasted about his physique and predicted the protagonist would one day surpass it. The protagonist froze, then exploded into a loud refusal that broke the room's tension. The sequence ended with a title frame and a quiet pastoral view outside the academy grounds. The instructor arranged the training weapons and addressed the assembled students about selection. He reminded them a practice weapon choice was wise before enrollment and that tests often used weapons. A muscular freshman then flashed confidence and invited everyone to choose freely. Students moved toward the racks while the protagonist lingered and reached for a weapon. Nearby Henith Harpulia asked if choosing a weapon was required to become a warrior. The instructor warned that real battles could occur at any time and urged practical readiness. Henith accepted the advice and agreed to select a suitable weapon promptly. The instructor arranged training weapons and told the students that practical choices mattered for tests. A muscular freshman boasted, and others moved toward the racks. The protagonist stepped close to the weapons. He suggested a short dagger for Henith Harpulia. He explained its control and ease of carry. Henith recalled past success with a dagger in close combat. A flash of practiced skill returned. She accepted the recommendation and selected the dagger. The protagonist then examined his own weapon and hesitated. He was uncertain which to use for the upcoming training. The protagonist tested the blade with a precise swing, the arc clean and confident. Henith Harpulia watched approvingly and confirmed the dagger's suitability for close combat. A nearby student observed and wondered if the selections reflected a pattern among trainees. The protagonist hesitated over his own weapon, uncertain which one matched his skill. He weighed practicality and control instead of spectacle while the trainees waited. Another voice asked whether he should choose only one weapon, prompting a quiet tension. Those weapon choices would shape the group's training and immediate tactics that afternoon. The protagonist had already swung and judged blades under Henith Harpulia's watchful eye. Trainees murmured about patterns in the selections as he paused over his own choice. He weighed practicality and control over show when a voice asked for a single choice. Tension tightened among the assembled students. He chose a spear and tested a decisive thrust across the training ground. The motion was compact and practiced, the point met with a clean resistance. Spectators went quiet, a nearby student showed open surprise, and instructors took note. The protagonist had already swung and judged blades under Henith Harpulia's watchful eye. Trainees murmured about patterns as he paused over his choice and thrust the spear across the training ground. Later voices compared the moment to Genesis, but said it differed. A brown-haired trainee asked Mr. Rudo for intentions about enrollment. The protagonist said he had worked as a mercenary to survive. He added he had lost his family to a dragon. Students fell silent. He answered a direct question simply with "I am." Henith stepped closer and demanded a clearer identity. A foot slammed down and tension tightened. The protagonist stood with blades slung across his back as trainees murmured. Henith Harpulia stepped forward and demanded a clearer identity. He replied in terse lines and kept his gaze steady. A training instructor cut through the talk and ordered every student to choose a weapon. Voices rose over the physical requirements and the day's procedures. A hostile trainee shouted at a named peer, while another whispered Balak Stero's name. The protagonist listened without flinching as the crowd's tension thickened. The protagonist stood with blades slung across his back as a muscular senior strode forward and proclaimed Storigo's combatants used no weapons. The assembled students tensed and murmured doubts. Henith Harpulia pushed for a name while others asked if anyone knew the man. An instructor stepped between them and ordered calm. The protagonist raised a hand, waved off the panic, and told freshmen not to pretend they had not seen him. From above the field, the trainees clustered and watched. Henith asked the protagonist if he was allied with the stranger, and the protagonist answered he did not know. The assembled trainees broke into noise as Balak Steros was grabbed by a peer and shouted at for crawling to a friend while the instructor spoke. Henith Harpulia and the protagonist stood nearby and exchanged terse words about their relationship to the stranger. The instructor reminded Balak Steros that family traditions forbade weapons, but that training rules required participation. He warned that continued refusal to pick a weapon would force Balak Steros to repeat the year. The protagonist briefly remembered a past life expectation that others would allow the behavior to continue, then watched the class settle under the instructor's authority. The protagonist snapped upward and yelled in disbelief at the unfolding rule dispute. He demanded whether the past had changed, voice tight and urgent. Balak Steros stood nearby indifferent and picked at his face, giving no clear answer. Henith Harpulia recoiled with visible shock and suspicion. The assembled trainees fell silent, eyes shifting as they weighed the possibility that expectations had shifted. The protagonist searched the group for confirmation, while the instructor's earlier warning lingered in the air, leaving the class tense and expectant. The protagonist rose and gripped the sword as voices frayed across the training hall. He demanded whether the past had changed and whether old expectations still applied to them. Balak Steros remained near and picked at his face without offering an answer. Henith Harpulia stepped back and watched him with suspicion and visible shock. The students went quiet, eyes shifting as they measured how the dispute might change training. The instructor's warning lingered in the air, while the protagonist searched for confirmation among them. The protagonist still held the sword as voices rose across the training ground. Balak Steros remained beside him and refused to give any clear answer. The instructor warned that refusing a weapon risked failure for any trainee. The protagonist snapped at that order and challenged the rule loudly in public. Students watched and shifted their weight while murmurs ran through them quietly. Balak offered a pair of gloves and urged him to fight without ceremony. The protagonist hesitated, weighing duty against pride and past expectations and fear. No clear support emerged from the crowd, and the trial was about to begin. The instructor addressed the assembled students and announced the trial rules in a clear voice. The protagonist still held the sword, while Balak Steros stood at his side. Balak offered a pair of gloves and urged the protagonist to fight. Murmurs passed through the students as the protagonist hesitated, weighing duty and pride. A red-haired student and a blue-haired peer questioned whether the wrapped wrist was a weapon. The instructor demanded clarity and asked what kind of tool the trainee held. The protagonist retreated inward, resolving to present himself calmly and hide any weakness. The instructor's roster was held and read aloud as the academy entered its first autumn week. Students moved through stone corridors, while the faculty focused mostly on theory this term. The administration used the opening days to note each recruit's performance and scout latent abilities. Loose sheets spun from a clipboard as a gray-haired official tracked names and notes. Balak Steros walked beside the protagonist, and the red-haired student Henith Harpulia kept pace. Private barbs passed between them, and a voice called another foolish. Tensions tightened, but the trainees maintained outward calm and careful posture. The academy's roster had been read as autumn settled. Trainees moved with careful posture. An impatient voice cut across the hall and berated two recruits with slurs. The protagonist looked puzzled, while Henith Harpulia stared back. Henith snapped that she was not a pet and declared herself a warrior in heated tones. Nearby students watched and murmured, but kept distance. A pale student then announced, "I'm Wilhelm Peters from Class B." A hand flicked and a harsh retort followed. The corridor tightened with tension as the trainees maintained outward control. After the roster finished, the hall remained taut with held breath and cold glances. A green-haired student confronted Henith Harpulia and flicked her hair in derision. Henith snapped and declared she was not a pet. The protagonist stepped between them and ordered calm, warning the green-haired student and telling Henith to move aside. The green-haired student then challenged the protagonist about training weapons and standing out. Nearby students watched without intervening. The protagonist thought briefly about how he had already acted to stand out earlier that day. After the roster finished, the hall stayed taut with quiet and narrowed stares. A green-haired student approached Henith Harpulia and flicked her hair, taunting her. Henith snapped that she was not a pet. The protagonist stepped between them and ordered calm, warning the green-haired student and telling Henith to move aside. The taunter challenged the protagonist about training weapons and standing out. Nearby students watched without intervening. The protagonist then struck, bringing the taunter down with a swift blow. He and Henith exchanged curt words as others reacted, and tension settled back into the room. When the roster ended, the hall remained taut under narrowed stares. A green-haired student had flicked Henith Harpulia's hair and provoked her. Henith snapped that she was not a pet, and the protagonist stepped between them to order calm. The taunter challenged the protagonist about training weapons and standing out, and the protagonist had struck first. The green-haired student then recovered and lunged, screaming profanities. The protagonist responded with a low, precise kick that sent the attacker sprawling across the floor. Nearby students watched in stunned silence as Henith covered her mouth. The attacker slumped, bloodied and groaning, while tension settled back into the room. Tension remained high after the earlier scuffle, and the hall stayed silent. The green-haired attacker rose, grabbed a baton, and shouted a rough string of curses. Henith screamed and quickly covered her mouth as trainees froze in place. The protagonist stepped forward to stop the assault and calm the room. The attacker swung wildly, and a voice barked, "Shut UP," before contact. A blue-clad figure moved with a blade and met the baton with a harsh parry. The parry snapped the attacker's swing aside, and the protagonist followed with a counterstrike. A black caption named Stero's Style highlighted the motion as students gasped. The room fell into stunned silence, while tension settled back over the trainees. The green-haired attacker lunged with a baton and shouted as trainees froze in place. The protagonist moved in blue and met the swing with a hard parry. He followed with a counterstrike that sent the attacker sprawling across the floor. The room shuddered as students gasped and stared at the fallen figure. The protagonist said, "Consider it a lesson," as murmurs rippled through the hall. Henith Harpulia's eyes widened, and she thought that her family was involved. A voice demanded what was happening, while trainees gathered around the scene. Silence settled heavy as instructors and onlookers waited for a full explanation. The hallway erupted as onlookers accused a trainee of striking Wilhelm Peters first. Henith Harpulia and other students argued whether the attack began or escalated. Several nearby witnesses insisted that Rudo Donatos had only responded after provocation. An instructor pointed out that Rudo had not used any weapon during the scuffle. A bloodied sword lay on the floor, and it drew careful attention and speculation. Supervisors ordered the injured student taken to the clinic immediately and escorted the wounded. They then directed Rudo Donatos to report to the office after classes for questioning. Whispers about the Donatos family trailed through the corridor as murmurs grew. The corridor noise persisted after the scuffle, and the crowd thinned around the injured student. The protagonist stood guarded and refused to reveal what had happened, insisting he would not say. He made a flippant claim about being a genius. Henith Harpulia and a brown-haired student approached and probed him with pointed questions about secrets and loyalties. They warned that a trainee hiding something could be dangerous and suggested either keeping distance or staying close as a precaution. The protagonist listened, allowed a private smile, and then walked on down the hall. The corridor remained noisy after the scuffle, and the crowd thinned around the injured trainee. A small cluster of students traded insults at a nearby table, and their voices cut across the hall. Henith Harpulia and another student moved toward the protagonist and pressed him with questions and warnings. A taller companion barked that they would be late and urged Rudo to hurry. The protagonist let a private smile pass and kept walking. He stayed silent, steeled himself, and told himself no one was dead yet and that no one would die this time. The protagonist excused himself and left after being told to get some rest. He allowed a private smile, steadied his breathing, and moved on. He thought he had not done anything wrong, yet still wanted to speak gently first. A woman poured a hot drink and said there had been no need for further apologies. The panel then shifted to 20 minutes earlier to show the exchange. There the protagonist bowed and formally apologized for causing a commotion. The protagonist excused himself and left after a private smile, steadying his breathing before moving on. He thought he had not done anything wrong, yet still wanted to speak gently first.